Podcasting from a remote location somewhere deep in the heart of New York City. This is Crypto Characters, and I'm your host, Jason Nagy. Our guest for today is privacy lawyer Jarno Vanto. Jarno, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jason. Good to be here.
So did I say your name right? Jarno
yes,
Vanto?
you did. Yeah, you did.
Okay, good.
Good job.
Thank you. So you and I are colleagues, right? We'll get that right off the bat.
Right.
But you're a privacy lawyer, and I focus a lot on fintech and blockchain.
Yeah.
And I remember last year, I didn't see you for most of the year because you were pretty much jammed doing GDPR compliance stuff, right?
Correct, yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your practice, privacy law, how you've interacted with GDPR, what it's done, and we'll talk about how it interacts with blockchain and fintech and what you're seeing out there.
Right.
Now, before we do that, I want to ask you a personal question.
Mm-hmm.
How much of my private data is out there right now?
How much of it? Everything. I don't want to. To be honest, most of.
And when I say mine, I mean ours. I mean everybody's, right?
Right. Everybody's data is out there in one form or another. Typically, for example, when we now engage in mobile devices 24/7, and then our other devices, they're tracking us. And anything and everything we do with those devices, including the locations of those devices, are known to a number of third parties. So there's not much.
It's very comforting to know that.
Right. But that's the nature of where we're headed. And therefore there are laws out there that intend to protect us in some ways, one of which is this GDPR that we're going to be talking about today.
Does that stand for Gross Domestic Product Research?
No, it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's an European Union statute that's been, that's the law now in 28 if you count in the UK.
Maybe not.
Right?
Maybe it's 37.
Right. Countries in Europe, and it is intended to be a technology neutral, but we'll get back to that point later. A law that applies to any and every type of processing of personal data. And when I say personal data, we talk about it in broad terms. For example, not only things like your names and your social security numbers and things like that, but then also data generated by website cookies, mobile device identifiers, all of those things that can be used to identify your essentially personal data and are within the ambit of GDPR.
So I don't want to get too 101, but cookies sound delicious. Why don't you tell us what they do? Or is there anything new that they're doing? Because I think you can give a general definition, but is there new stuff going on with cookies?
Well, cookies are software that are installed in your browser, and cookies are there to basically perform two types of purposes. One of which is perfectly legit and important, is to enable functionalities of the website, right? So, for example, if you have things in your shopping cart, it's a cookie that makes sure that all the goods you buy on a website stay on that shopping cart, that then you're able to complete the transaction. And then there are so-called advertising cookies that perform different functionality. They track your click patterns, for example, on websites, what types of areas of the website you're interested in, what types of ads you click, and then they may also recognize you across sites. So let's say you go from one news site to a product website, web store. The cookie might be able to identify with your browser that you've been on that website before, and then to push to that other website advertising that the cookie thinks is relevant for you. And then there are analytics cookies that analyze how, that are strictly speaking not advertising cookies. They're there to analyze how the website visitor interacts with the website, which parts of the website they click, which IP address they came from. Has that IP address visited the website before? Things like that. That, again, are there to improve the functionality of the website and make it more relevant for the visitor.
So I guess that's why when my kids will start using my computer, I'm going to see all sorts of ads for bubblegum and Candy Crush.
Right.
Is that still a game, Candy Crush?
It is. It's still a game.
Do you have it on your phone?
I don't. I don't have that on my phone, no.
All right. So before we go a little deeper into the way the data is used with us, against us, however you want to clarify it, I want to talk a little bit about Jarno the man. So you're originally from Finland, right?
Right.
And what brought you to the U.S.?
I came here first as a legal intern at the Finnish UN mission, which is actually not far from where we are right now. This was some time ago. Then I stayed here for law school, and then I ended up staying here. It looks like forever.
Right. So you went to law school in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Did you ever practice in Finland?
Never.
Really?
Yeah.
Did you go to college there?
Yeah, I did. I went to law school there as well. So I have a European law degree as well.
Gotcha. So you have a European law degree, but you came over here right after that.
Right.
Have you ever wanted to practice in Finland?
No. I did manage a New York office for a law firm that's headquartered out of Helsinki for close to 5 years. And so I've always maintained a contact. I have clients from that region, but I've never really considered moving back there.
You were the one who told me that the tallest mountain in Finland is no longer the tallest mountain after last summer because it was a glacier and the glacier melted. Was that you that told me that?
No, but it was actually Sweden, not Finland.
Oh, it's Sweden, okay. Yeah. But then you told that to me, right?
I did, yeah.
Okay, all right. That's a wild story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how long have you been practicing for?
Since 2004, yeah, so.
Always privacy? Or data?
I mean, there have always been other elements in my practice, but privacy has always been a key component of the practice, for sure. These days, in addition to the compliance work, I do a lot of tech transaction work relating to licensing of data for various purposes, including for advertising purposes and other purposes. And commercialization of data is becoming more and more important, not just for the ad tech industry, but for other industries as well that want to monetize the data that they have.
Commercialization of data, that sounds nefarious.
It's not necessarily nefarious. It can serve perfectly valid and important purposes. For example, it's not only third-party commercialization. For example, data can be used, and it's not always personal data. It can be machine-generated data.
Like what?
Like, for example, there are sensors installed in all kinds of equipment that are used for industrial purposes out there, starting from like mining equipment to power plants to jet engines to all those, to generate a ton of data, and companies see a huge commercial value in it that they can use, for example, to service those machines better, detect when there are malfunctions, things like that are purely the result of analyzing data, right?
Okay. So what kind of data are they being? Let me rephrase that question.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of data is out there for consumers, and how is it being used today? Because I think all of that does tie into the ways that you can perhaps, as an individual, monetize your own data or perhaps protect it. So
right. I mean, most of the data that's out there of consumers is these days is a result of not only the forms you fill online. Say, for example, if you join a new website or become a member on a website or download a new app, you always have to give up some information, like what your email address is or date of birth or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of data is generated by means of software. So there are all these analytics tools out there that analyze, what you view online, where you are in the physical space, what types of websites you browse, all that that you don't have to actively do anything in order for that data to be generated. It's done automatically, and then that data obviously has commercial value, right? Because that enables companies to target advertising more effectively for people that fit into certain segments of consumers.
Okay.
Right.
Can you do that in Europe? Do they allow that stuff?
Yes, but when this GDPR that we talked about entered into force last year, what GDPR requires, as opposed to, for example, American laws that are out there, is that there always be a so-called legal basis for processing personal data.
What does that mean, legal basis?
So a company can't just take personal data and start using it for its own purposes. It must have some kind of a enumerated legal basis. The GDPR enlists certain legal basis that a company must have, and if it doesn't have one of those, then it's illegal for that company to process personal data.
Do they need a waiver or a release, or is it just a list of stuff?
So most commonly used in the commercial environment, the legal basis are consent. So in other words, that a company actually gets the person's consent to process that person's personal data.
Okay.
And then there is so-called legitimate interest, which means that a company has legitimate interest, for example, to sometimes process personal data to protect, say, the security of their website or the security of their software that they're putting out there.
How does that work?
It always has to be balanced against the privacy interests of the user.
Mm-hmm.
And now what's emerged is that, for example, for these so-called ad tech companies that are out there analyzing the web traffic data and the site visitor data, mobile app data, that they can't really rely on that legitimate interest. They have to rely on consent, which means that European users of mobile apps and websites, what they've started to see over the last few months is all these consent screens that tell you, or the users out there, what purposes the data is being used for, who are the third parties having access to that data, and these long lists and long consent screens. And it's really quite, the European user experience.
Is it annoying everyone now?
It's the European user experience has gotten a little bit different from the American user experience, say.
So in Europe, they have all this consent, so they can't ever get to anything. And
right.
Us, we don't know what they're doing, but we can look at whatever we want.
But again, it's a serious question for mobile advertising, obviously, and online
Mm-hmm.
advertising, because again, companies that want to be compliant, they have to get those consents. And otherwise they're essentially out of business there. And so it's led to changes, it's led to industry-wide coalitions around consent mechanisms and so-called consent management platforms, CMPs, that are emerging. And
sounds like that's an end run around the entire purpose of all the consents. Like you consent for everything if you want clean browsing. Is that what that is?
Well, there are criticisms, and it's not. Well, for example, just to give you kind of another perspective on this.
Right.
So California recently adopted the so-called Consumer Privacy Act.
Do they do anything good, by the way, California, as a state?
Well, the California went down a different path in terms of how its approach to this data collection business, right? They didn't go down the consent path. So U.S. companies that collect, and by the way, so the statute will not enter into force until 2020, and they're implementing regs that come into force that are going to be issued by July 2020.
And there's a lot of industry opposition to the rule too, right? Isn't?
Well, I mean, that we already have that. It was enacted, and but there are specifications that are going to be coming out. But
Mm-hmm.
still, the approach is different. It's not based on consent. So, because Europe thinks that, okay, so before you get that consent, you can't collect any data, right?
Okay.
California said you can keep collecting data, but you have to give individuals a right to opt out and right to prohibit the sale of their data to all these third parties that are out there.
That actually sounds like it's a nice idea.
Right, and so again.
So maybe I have to take it back. Maybe they do some things right from a legislative perspective.
Right. So what the changes that both GDPR and this upcoming California Privacy Act have kind of set in motion are that companies are starting to list in their privacy policies and disclosures all these third parties are tapping into the data. It used to be that you would look at a privacy policy and hardly anyone looks at those, but it used to be just to say we may share your personal data with our advertising partners or something like that. Now it's more that we're sharing your personal data with companies X, Y, and Z, and enlisting and naming those out there. And so that is generating transparency in the way data gets shared and who actually is in that whole food chain of data.
Is it actually effective? I mean, is there real transparency, or is it just is it the beginning they're rolling it out so we don't know what it's going to look like? And by the way, did you ever watch the South Park episode called Centipede?
I did not watch that.
You'll find it amusing because I think that they all signed up to all sorts of horrible things happening to them by using Apple. So.
Right. But it's what it also has caused is that companies that don't want to be transparent about their data practices are being sidelined in some ways because again, if you want to be compliant, and most companies do, honestly want to be compliant.
Right. Otherwise, you can't make money, right?
Right. So then those companies that don't want to be transparent, that don't want to expose their kind of data networks to the public are being sidelined.
And where is that happening? Is it just in California, or is that?
Well, I mean,
we've talked about a bunch, so let's pull in a little bit and. We were just talking about where is that? U.S.?
So obviously, for the U.S., I mean, no company is going to build a fence around California, and most companies are going to have to comply with the California statute because it's just the two largest population of consumers out there to be completely blocked from services. So most companies are probably going to be in the U.S. adopting a California approach to all of their data collection. So it's definitely having an impact nationwide. But then also what we learned and what we're still learning as part of the GDPR compliance experience has been that many companies who are doing business with European consumers and or have offices out there and have European employees because then they've decided to adopt those same approaches to all of their users, because again, building fences around different segments of your audience is difficult, right?
Right.
You can do it, but that's also it's expensive to begin with, and all these efforts to regulate this kind of personal data-based economy are, even though the laws are regional, right, they still have global implications.
Right. Just keep that mic a little closer.
Yeah.
You can move the arm.
Right. Yeah, it's good.
Right. Okay. So it also sounds like California going a different route than the GDPR might cause complications for companies that are international and work in the U.S. and Europe.
Right. In some ways, yes, but what California did in a similar way that was done with GDPR was that it gave users and consumers. California statute talks about consumers.
Right.
GDPR talks about so-called data subjects.
Data subjects?
Data subjects, yes. broad rights. For example, the right to review what data a company has about me, right to know which third parties have access to my data and all that. And those are pretty similar to GDPR. There's some terminological differences, but really the broad rights to users are similar to GDPR, and that everyone has kind of a way to access their data and have their data deleted upon request and kind of opt out of that whole data collection process. And those are similar. So while it's not fully overlapping in terms of what companies need to do, there are similar elements to it. And so companies that have done their GDPR compliance and are now working on their GDPR compliance are very well prepared to also comply with the California statute.
So how big is the data market that we're talking about?
Well,
on a U.S. basis and then on an EU basis.
It's in the I would say ballpark. It's in the billions, depending on how you classify it, because there's so-called Lumascape, which includes all the ad tech companies and data brokers.
What's Lumascape?
Lumascape is just a term of art for all these ad tech companies, and if you Google that, you can find out what types of companies are part of that whole industry. But then there are so it's hard to segment it, categorize it in a way that you would have a market size, because, for example, so-called first-party data, meaning like if you go to, say, a large consumer website, they also use their own data for advertising on their different sites, but there are no third parties involved. There's commercial value in there as well.
Can you wait? I lost you there. Let's step back and go over that again.
Right. And so it's hard to put a dollar figure on the size of the market.
No, but it was a legitimate. It was a right. Sincere question.
Right.
I want to understand what you just said. I got lost in all of that.
Right. So there are so-called data brokers out there.
Okay.
That
Data brokers.
Broker data that they typically source from third parties other than them. So, for example, an ad tech company that collects data from all these different websites, right? Through cookies. They're so-called third parties. They're data brokers. They don't have a direct relationship with the consumers, right?
Okay.
They're just, for example, tracking the activity on third-party websites that they don't own or operate. They just install.
They're a service provider,
right?
And
right.
That's what a data broker is, a service provider.
It could be a service provider, or it could be just a piece of software on a website that's there to generate advertising revenue for that website. We could characterize as service providers.
Okay.
But then they also monetize the data themselves.
So they take the data, they find out what people are looking at.
Yeah.
And then they use that data for their own benefits, right?
To create so-called audience segments around certain categories of consumers. Right?
Give me an example of what they're doing.
So let's say that a brand
mm-hmm.
is interested in advertising to people that are 38 to 45 and live in New Jersey.
Okay.
Certain areas of New Jersey, and then they potentially have an income of, I don't know, $120,000 a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then they buy an audience for that brand from a data broker.
An audience for that brand. What does that mean?
And so they've identified through browsing habits that there are people in that part of New Jersey that make $120 at age 38 to 45 based on their analytics.
Okay, let's go one deeper.
Yeah, right.
How do they get all that information from web browsing?
Software analytics. So they analyze that certain behaviors only are certain behaviors only belong to a certain group of people, right?
Okay. Do you have any examples of behaviors? I'm curious. I mean, there's a lot of psychology or sociology in this.
There is, yes, absolutely there is, and there are data scientists out there in these companies who try to make that data more meaningful as it is being generated 24/7 to 365.
So, all right. Is it a data scientist or a psychologist that determines that certain behavior is an indicator of certain things? Who does that?
It depends. Most of it is just software-based analysis.
AI?
They are using AI tools as well. Yeah.
So there's software-based analyses that are not AI that they use to pick up patterns or habits of people in certain categories that include income, that include where you live,
where you potentially work.
Where you work. How about
do you have children?
Your race, ethnicity?
There are industry standards that are ethical standards that prevent companies from doing that, but not all data brokers are members of the industry associations that uphold these standards.
Okay, so not whether they do that, but they're capable of breaking down individuals based upon, well, they have profiles effectively of individuals.
They have profiles of segments. They're not really interested in Jason Nagy.
Right. Well, right. I mean, who is? I think there's one guy who's interested in Jason Nagy, and you're looking at him right now.
and they're more interested in whether you're an attorney and you're in a certain income bracket and you may have children. So things like that they're more interested in.
God, well, I can understand why children, because then they could send you all these like bye-bye baby stuff and all these other places that you go.
But then.
So who creates that list is generated, or those categories are generated by computer programming and industrial psychologists, data scientists.
Sometimes there are psychologists. It's more of a more recent trend to have, for example, people trained in humanities understanding data better. But then it's typically computer scientists that are doing the crunching.
That's fascinating. Is there a name for the type of computer scientist that does that, or is it just
a data scientist?
Data scientist. So data scientists are the ones that are doing that.
Right.
I have a friend who I found out is a data scientist. He's only a couple of years in. I'm going to ask him some questions. All right. So now there's a whole new level of nefariousness to the word data scientist. It sounded cool before, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, it
I'm only kidding.
Yeah, of course. Right. But I mean, there are ways of looking at it, and whether something is better or worse just depends on because obviously, advertising's been around forever.
Right.
And the fact that we're now online all the time has enabled brands to target consumers in a way that was not possible before, and so if we don't like that's occurring, then typically we address it through laws, and some of these laws are giving people the right to at least opt out of that if they so wish, and of course there are all these not only laws, but there are all these technical tools out there that are available for you and I if we want to control the way that this data is being generated.
Like VPN?
VPN is one, but then, for example, for browsing, there are several tools that block, for example, cookies from being functional in your browser.
Oh, really?
Oh, there's a ton of tools.
Do they work though? Do they shut the browser down?
They might have an impact on the functionality of the websites, right? So if for example, if you disable all cookies, for example, the shopping cart, for example, might not work at all.
That's kind of funny.
So there are those tools out there, and then your mobile devices, all these different. For example, you can limit ad tracking.
Actually, I think you opened up my phone one day. You're like, here, do you have all this? Right. Turned out I did. But
right. And so you can limit ad tracking on your phone, and prevent the collection of location data by certain applications, things like that you can do and proactively limit the data collection.
Okay.
But again, there's always a price to pay, right? Because certain functionalities are not there if you limit and so
it's kind of a weird thing when you think about it, right? Because it's like there are these things that a lot of people don't like, particularly privacy advocates, and I recognized long ago that if I was going to go onto Facebook, then I was going to give up all of my data to Facebook, which is why I never really did much on that website.
Right.
All these people that were shocked
Right.
Was it last year now with the Facebook stuff? It was like, did you guys miss that they're very open and honest about what they could and couldn't do. I don't really get it, but so I get it, and I get that there are certain things that you give up. Like, if I decide to look for underwear online, on my phone, I know that if I'm logged into one, I think it's maybe is it Chrome or something like that. Then I'll get ads on my YouTube. Right. When I go into my computer and I have my name logged in and all of that stuff. Right. And I just deal with looking at the pictures of the stuff that I looked at before.
And I mean, there are products in all kinds of categories out there that do provide privacy protections, but they cost money, and so.
You mean VPNs? Because I think those are.
VPNs are one thing, and then there's messaging tools out there that also protect privacy and all. But it's not just those. There are many out there. But again, you have to be willing to pay the price. And if you're not willing to pay whatever it is, then you use free services, right? And those free services are often funded by advertising, and in order for that advertising to be effective, they need to understand their audiences. Right?
Do you remember there was talk about how if you say something with your Facebook app open or your WhatsApp open, because those two were connected, that you'll start getting ads for what you talked about on your phone? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember that, but
I think it was debunked. It sounded a little far-fetched to me. But so what was the story with that?
No, it's just that the apps would have had this built-in capability of kind of listening, but
they don't.
I don't buy that. I mean, I'm sure if there was a built-in feature, but I don't see that with the huge risks relating to not disclosing that to your users. I don't think that's occurring.
So, in fact, there are apps that have the capability to listen?
Well, of course, every app that you talk to has a capability to listen.
Yeah, but then to collect data based on that?
Well, the data will be collected because it's needed for the functionality of the app.
For a conversation?
Yeah.
Like the subject matter of a conversation, I would think, isn't.
No, right. And so it's being communicated through the app, and there's so many variations of this theme that I could go on forever. But there's a capability to collect voice data and video data, as we know, and whether that's then used for purposes other than what is stated is just not legal, right?
In other words, so there is an ability to collect voice data and video data,
right?
But you're not allowed to use it. Is that
well? If you don't disclose that, and I'm not sure that any of these companies have told that they're just surreptitiously collecting voice data.
Now, the requirements for disclosure of use of that kind of data,
right?
Does that fall under any particular data statutes? Are there data statutes in the U.S.?
Well, it's not a data statute, but there's a consumer protection statute at the federal level called the FTC Act Section 5.
Okay.
Which applies to all types of consumer disclosures out there, including privacy policies and statements that companies make about their data products and services, right?
Right.
So if a company is not honest and truthful in their disclosures and deceitful acts or practices that they employ, then they're potentially subject to the FTC enforcement activity under the authority of Section 5. And there are also similar state laws. And during the current administration, the FTC hasn't been as active as it was during the previous administration, but state attorneys general have actually been very active in enforcing similar consumer protection laws. It's more of a consumer protection approach rather than a privacy approach.
Consumer protection approach rather than privacy approach.
Right.
What's the difference? It strikes me as it's kind of the same.
Well, it's the point of the departure point is not the data collection itself. It's the fact that if you're telling something about your practices with respect to the data to consumers, you're essentially telling consumers what you do with their data.
Gotcha. So in other words,
you can also, but that the same applies to marketing of toothpaste too, right? So it's not a data issue. It's more of what you state to consumers about your product or service.
That's an interesting perspective to have.
Right.
Oh, fascinating. All right, so we'll go into GDPR in 1 second, but what I wanted to ask you before we get there is focusing now on the U.S. and the way that, what is the regulatory scheme for privacy? Because you've mentioned FDCX, right? And then is it the CPFB, the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau or something like that?
Finance Protection Bureau.
Yeah.
So
that's different from the FDCX.
It is correct. Yes.
Who is the watchdog that enforces the FDCX violations?
The Federal Trade Commission.
So it's the Federal Trade Commission.
Yeah.
And because the CPFB, that's the organization that is being
that enforces, for example, the statute called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that then governs financial personal information disclosures.
Gotcha.
For the
Okay.
financial services sector. Yeah.
So the Federal Trade Commission governs general data
across the board consumer disclosures.
So it's not just, is it data or consumer disclosures?
Consumer disclosures that involve data, but it could also involve other consumer products or services.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. All right. So the CPFB, that's the organization that's currently under siege right now. I think that there's a Second Circuit case that's seeking to find that it's unconstitutional.
Right.
But that's not really implicated, which is a good thing because I think that there might be some serious issues with the way that the CPFB was actually created, and the fact that you've got a federal agency and the executive branch can remove whoever is running it. To me, that just sounds absolutely nuts. But all right, so now, the Federal Trade Commission is pretty much what regulates consumer data across the board.
And
in the
their
US.
state attorneys general enforce the state consumer protection laws.
Now, are these all the lawsuits you read about where some poor company is being harassed by one of these lunatic fringe attorneys general, or are there conglomerates of attorneys general that move together in classes? I mean,
their jurisdiction is state specific, so they don't really, but they do coordinate work sometimes. But again, because they're enforcing state laws, so they can't really go beyond the state borders. As I mentioned, the activity in terms of enforcement for these consumer protection aspects of privacy have moved to the state levels of late, and many states, including New York, New Jersey here on the East Coast, have gone after companies that haven't been truthful in terms of their privacy disclosures.
So, final question for U.S. stuff. Is there a state that is the most protectionist as far as consumer data goes? Are there a couple of states that are like that?
Well, historically, California has been such a state. It was one of the, not the first state to implement broader consumer privacy protections. It's had a consumer privacy protection office, and now again at the forefront of regulation in terms of this new act, and so California is definitely one. Another worth mentioning, I guess, is Illinois. Illinois has introduced. They haven't made it all the way through the state legislature in many instances, but they've introduced a lot of legislation in this area. Delaware also.
Delaware, really?
Yeah, and New Hampshire introduced a new law regulating data brokers and the requirement for data brokers to register in that state. Other states, but those are definitely the ones that come off the top of my head.
Data brokers. To me, that is just a fascinating, telling name. I mean, do people say now that data is the new gold, or am I mixing that up? I think I might have heard something like that.
The new oil.
There you go, the new oil. Right.
I mean, it has huge value, but it's not all personal data that has privacy implications. There's also just industrial data that machines generate, and those have nothing to do with private individuals.
That's just how many times certain parts in a machine break down, stresses, things like that.
Right.
I would imagine that that's not particularly heavily regulated, right?
No, it isn't. in the same respect as personal data, and there's debates around how, for example, ownership of that data and all that. But given the I could talk about that for an hour, but we have to move to the GDPR and the blockchain, I guess. So
we don't have to. We could just talk about this. So well, actually, although I do want to touch upon that because I find that to be a fascinating concept from a business perspective, and I'll summarize it, and you tell me if I'm wrong. The idea is if I have a car and my car breaks down.
Remember, cars are consumer products. Again, there are privacy implications.
I have a truck.
Okay, right. That's well, there's a person driving that truck.
No, I'm a company that buys a garbage truck. I have a garbage truck.
Right.
Okay. Right. And the garbage truck breaks down. I've got a whole fleet of them there, by Boeing, right? They don't make garbage trucks, but let's just for this, it's good to use because that means that nobody could be upset with us for using it, right?
Yeah.
So Boeing now has a garbage truck line, and all of the data on their garbage trucks, they say they own. And the guys that buy the garbage trucks, the companies, they say, no, we own that data. Well, is that what it is, or is it something else?
Again, vehicles are not maybe the best example for machine-generated data because there are specific statutes at the federal level and the state level about who owns the car, vehicle-generated data, and typically it's the owner of the vehicle.
Really?
Yeah, but then again, variations to the theme because the whole concept of owning vehicles is going through a major transformation, and
because of all the leasing,
and people are there's all these new models of ownership, if you will, and so while on its face it looks simple, a car rental company owns thousands of vehicles.
It's true.
They're the owner,
right?
And other things, similarly, all these new kind of part-time ownership or membership-based models.
You mean like Zipcar? Or something else?
Then again, the owner is whoever operates that, and so it is certainly a complex area, and it's under development.
Well, this is also something that tokenization. I hate that term because it's a buzzword.
Right.
But using something like a form of token or using ownership of your data on the blockchain could allow individuals to monetize it whenever they want. Is anyone talking about that in the data circles yet? I mean, is it a part of the main conversation, or is that something that's kind of off to the side?
It's off to the side because and we're going to, I guess, touch upon it later, but fintech, while it's all about data, it hasn't, or the people that are working on issues related to personal data and privacy-related issues have just recently started looking at how these laws, for example, that were supposedly tech neutral.
Right. Yeah, you use that term, right?
No longer work in the blockchain world, right? And that's kind of a
technology neutral. That's how you describe the GDPR. Right?
Yeah, it was supposed to be technology neutral, but an interesting thing happened because it was built around
it being the GDPR, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And
so now we're onto the GDPR world. Okay,
right.
Great.
Right. And so GDPR has certain basic concepts, some of which I've already mentioned, the data subject being you and I, because any and every bit of data out there that can be used to identify you or I is personal data under GDPR. And then a key definition is data controller, right?
Okay.
A data controller is someone who determines the purposes and means of processing personal data. So in other words, a company that, for example, collects your data,
right,
determines that I'm going to use Jason Nagy's data for advertising purposes. So I'm going to target advertising to Jason Nagy based on Jason Nagy's browsing history.
Okay.
And so it was built around this concept that there's just one decision maker, if you will, right? That kind of pulls the strings and determines what's done with what, right?
Right.
And for what purposes. But blockchain doesn't work that way, right?
Right.
There can be any number of participants in a blockchain that can introduce data into the chain, and
I mean, anyone that's writing up to it, right?
Exactly. And so the concept of controller is ill-fitting for blockchain technology.
Right, because here the controller is essentially a network.
Right.
That has
right.
3,000 people,
right.
And it's constantly changing, and the makeup and the places of where those people are always changing.
Correct. Yeah.
So does that mean that blockchain doesn't fit the GDPR, that they don't have that it doesn't work? What does it mean?
Well,
legally,
it's a good question, but a company that is involved in or utilizing blockchain technology can't just go and tell the regulators that, by the way, since I'm blockchain, I don't need to comply with GDPR. Right?
A company, no, but a network, yes.
Yes.
So Bitcoin doesn't have to worry about it because no one owns the Bitcoin network.
Right. And so what's interesting now is that European regulators have recently having been faced with these questions about, because it's critical for compliance purposes to determine who is the controller, for example. Because the controller has all the liability and most of the obligations under GDPR.
And obviously all of the power too, right?
Right, exactly. And so, for example, who is controller in a blockchain? And interestingly enough, the French regulator, CNIL, which is the French Supervisory Authority for all things personal data.
What is it? What are the letters?
CNIL.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Just call it CNIL. Has issued guidance on this.
They probably say CNIL, or they don't pronounce the L, right?
They do. They issued guidance on the roles of controller and processor in the blockchain, right? And how you go about evaluating who is the controller. And they've determined, and interestingly enough, for companies implementing blockchains, and they've determined that participants in the blockchain are data controllers. So you can have essentially thousands of controllers in some scenarios. In some scenarios, you might have 10, depending on where that blockchain is utilized, right?
Right.
And what they also then said is that if
come a little closer to the mic, I want to hear your voice.
What they've also said that
that's much better.
Given that participants,
it's a beautiful velvety voice you have. You know that,
given that participants are controllers, one of those participants at least must have a modicum of decision-making power vis-a-vis the others, right? And so what they've said essentially is that all participants please agree on who would be the primary contact for all of you.
Is that a joke?
It's true.
No one's gonna, they're just going to ignore that. You can't even enforce. It's unenforceable.
Right.
It's I mean, the best they could have is maybe with Ethereum. They could argue that Vitalik Buterin, right, who is some say may have some sway, but really only if people agree, right?
Yeah.
But it's impossible. I mean, these are decentralized. They're decentralized for a reason because they don't want that control.
Yeah.
So what has been the response to this fairly ridiculous
critical
demand?
They even acknowledge in their own guidance that we still have to look into some of these issues in more detail. But it just shows that the GDPR, while at the time they began drafting it. Remember, there have been privacy laws in the books in Europe since the 70s, right?
It goes that far back?
Yeah. And the predecessor of GDPR, the Data Protection Directive, as it was called, was in the books since 1996.
Right.
And so a long time. And so... 1996? Yeah. And so one of the ambitions around GDPR was that it would, again, as I mentioned, would be technology neutral, but then it was still built around this thinking that you would have one data controller, right, that would call the shots and tell what data would be collected for what purposes and who the third parties that they would have access to it.
Plus,
right?
anybody, if it's a public blockchain, anyone in the world can look at it and mine it for data.
Correct. Yes. And again, permission blockchains, public blockchains, there are separate issues that those types of blockchains have to tackle. So that's one thing, and it's obviously still being worked on, and the kind of regulators are starting to adopt these different approaches. But as you mentioned, for example, just thinking that we would somehow be able to bring all the participants around the table and kind of agree on who the data controller is and who would be liaising, for example, with all these individuals whose data might be in the blockchain.
And by the way, which is anonymized,
right.
So no one is going to give that. I mean, it's so upside down. It's like they completely misunderstood the reason why.
No. I wouldn't characterize it as misunderstanding. It's just that you've been in this space for so long that really kind of this talk about blockchain exploded a couple of years back,
right?
In a way that everyone was kind of reading about it, and GDPR was being drafted for a long time, but blockchain was never part of that discussion and the kind of thinking that blockchain is decentralization of everything and kind of immutability of data.
But what it misunderstands is the public blockchains is the very ethos behind it. I mean, there's a strong, I would say a massive libertarian bent and anti-control and anti-governmental, really anti-governmental control lilt to the entire public blockchain space. Now, you can do all of that with private blockchains because there is someone that's moderating, and it's perfect for that. But the public blockchains is the issue. Now, it's probably not that big of an issue right now because I think the vast majority of public blockchains, or the ones that are primarily used, are blockchains that relate to cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the most common use. And for that, what do you know? Who transferred what and when. You have, you can't really do much with that data. All you can do is see dates and times of transfer, unless you know the people that are behind it. Yeah. So that part is probably not.
And I think that some of the analysis that the French regulator issued is more applicable to private permission blockchains rather than public blockchains. And another aspect of how, and I think that we're still going to figure out a way unless, and I'm not too optimistic there will be any kind of an amendment to the GDPR because it was a huge project.
How long did it take to draft and pass?
God, it must have been at least 6-7 years.
Wow.
So it took a while. But again, so that's why I'm not too optimistic there will be an immediate willingness to go and amend it. So
no one wants to mess with that.
And so that's why I think that they're just going to have to figure out ways in which, and those ways will have to include technical solutions as well. So on that point, for example, one of the basic rights, that GDPR grants to data subjects.
Can I guess it? The right to forget?
Well, the right to erasure.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Right.
Close.
And so you can't really do that
on a blockchain.
Right.
Yeah. It's literally impossible without destroying blocks, which then undermines the entire.
And it's a fundamental right, and one of the specifically named rights under GDPR, and then again proposals out there for how to tackle that in the blockchain world are, for example, that you keep, for example, the personal data itself out of the blockchain and only have so-called commitments in the blockchain that recognize that the personal data has been given, but it's not in the blockchain. And again, some of these solutions might sound a little fantastical given the reality, but they will, or what's already happening is that in order for companies to comply, they have to come up with technical or data controllers to comply with, and the creators of blockchains for different purposes have to come up with utilities and solutions that are less than perfect for the kind of frictionless flow of data in the blockchain, right?
So here's a question, though,
right.
Or maybe an observation. Maybe it's right, maybe it isn't. You tell me.
Right.
It strikes me that currently most public blockchains, well, any public blockchain is going to have anonymized codes, sequences of numbers for people.
Right.
So the only way that you're ever going to get that information is if someone lets it go, and then it's intentionally made public,
right.
or someone makes a mistake, someone else finds it, and then that finder takes it and makes it public.
Right.
Then it strikes me that the person that's controlling it would be the person that releases it.
Right.
And if you are a private blockchain, if you're an administrator of a private blockchain, then you just have to comply with it.
Yes.
And I would imagine that most blockchains also have anonymized sequences of letters and numbers as indicators anyway.
Right.
So have people gone into that much yet, or are they still kind of figure it out?
So again, like how you define what constitutes personal data is whether you can reasonably identify the person, right?
Right.
And if it's just a hash, or if it's just a set of numbers, and whoever has access to it can, using reasonable means, cannot identify the person, then it's not personal data, right?
But isn't that the case with any public blockchain that is, right? So
correct. Then
public blockchains, it sounds like, may not necessarily have a huge issue with GDPR as they stand now.
Right, right.
That only changes then is if you can, is it reasonably, you said?
Yeah.
Reasonably identify the person?
Yeah.
Okay, well that's actually not a bad thing.
Right. Right.
Have people started taking notice of this stuff? I mean,
again, it's a work in progress.
Okay.
And there's interpretive guidance out there, like for example the French one I mentioned, and a couple other, but we have no definitive guidance yet. Europe-wide guidance on how GDPR actually works in the blockchain. This is just one member state. There's a conclave of supervisory authorities. There's regulators called the Data Protection Supervisory Board.
Okay.
That issues these guidance documents two, three times a year on topics running from everything to sensitive personal data to transferring data outside the EU and all that.
Wow.
And they have not yet issued guidance on blockchain. It's coming.
Okay.
But up until now, these solutions and how to kind of fit the framework of GDPR and the blockchain are less than perfect.
Okay.
And I believe that most of the guidance is useful for private blockchains rather than public blockchains. And again, pointing to what you just said, given that there's hardly any reasonable way often in the public blockchains to identify the person by anyone other than that person himself or herself, that data is not often personal data at all. So it's not subject to GDPR, right?
Right.
But then as we start seeing all these different applications for blockchain, more and more data will be inserted there by parties other than the person themselves. Like if you think of cryptocurrency, for example.
Right.
But if you start moving, for example, to real estate related data, things like that.
Right, because if you're dealing with real estate,
Right.
then you're going to be able to see
Right.
exactly
Right.
who it is.
Right.
Wow, Jarno, you just blew my mind, man. No, but you're right. I thought we had it all figured out here in this little podcast, but that's true. Once you make it to information that's publicly trackable,
Right.
then you're going to know who the owner of the real estate is or was.
Right.
You'll know what they paid for it.
Right.
You'll know what the taxes are. Right.
Right.
And whatever other information they
Right.
want to put up there.
Right.
But you know that anyway. I mean, I don't know what it's like in Europe, so you'll have to school me on that. But it's, here, you know. I mean, I go on in New York City. I could put in an address and find out who owns it and what the debt is.
Yeah, that's a good point. But kind of keeping the ideas of private and public information separate from just what is personal data, right?
Right.
So the more there is data in the blockchain, then that is dependent on the functionality of the blockchain, with the intended purpose of the blockchain. The more there is personal data, regardless of whether that is publicly available somewhere through Google searches or whatnot, it's still personal data, and then the participant in that blockchain becomes a data controller if they're using that blockchain for business purposes.
Well, for real estate records, it's never going to be a group of individuals. It's going to be a private blockchain
Right.
that should be publicly available, and it'll be run by the local governments. And in the U.S., it's at the county level.
Right.
I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like in the EU.
Yeah, and then another tricky aspect of GDPR is obviously the.
I'm losing you. Come closer.
Oh, sorry.
There you go, brother. All right.
Another tricky aspect is the right to have the incorrect data corrected. And does
the GDPR? Let me interrupt you for 1 second. Does it apply to governments?
Yes, it does.
It does.
Yes, it does.
Wow. So all of the governments pass laws that limits their ability to deal with public data.
Well, limit is, I guess, when the government processes personal data.
Yeah.
Some member states, EU member states, actually went because they could. The member states had a choice whether GDPR applies also to state and local governments or not. And some states went and decided that GDPR would not apply.
Okay.
But still, GDPR applies to governments processing personal data in most cases in Europe.
Okay.
And the government entities can also be fined, as private corporations would be fined under GDPR.
Right.
But those are capped at 20 million.
20 million what?
Euros. Yeah.
But that means that you can't ever. That means that you can't have public land records made available at all now in Europe.
Yeah, you can, as long as you comply with GDPR.
Well, how do you do that? The owner it's on the deed. I mean, deeds come from certainly from the UK.
Right.
I mean,
and those are processing personal data, and they need the data for complying with the law, which provides that certain information needs to be processed by those government entities under law.
So that I got you. Okay. Yeah. So there's a carve out for it then.
Right. Yeah.
I see. So they're covered.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
All right. That's better.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, then you should still be able to use blockchain as a publicly available database, even for land records then.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So when I was going over GDPR back when you were like pulling your hair out trying to get all of these companies' GDPR compliant policies ready.
Yeah.
It struck me as perhaps there might be some sort of incompatibility between blockchain and the GDPR. But it seems like until blockchain's usage changes, and I think you described it as writing up data that contains personal information onto a blockchain, until that stuff starts to happen, you don't have to worry about it for blockchain, it being GDPR. Is that a fair...
Yeah. I guess sounds about fair, but the challenge is, I would say that once there is personal data
right
in the blockchain, you need to comply with GDPR. But then the rights that GDPR provides and the restrictions it imposes on companies that process personal data
right
are not fully compatible with how blockchain works, right? So it gets tricky. And for example, one of the aspects is that another example of this.
Take us through it. I want to hear it.
Right. And so public blockchains, as we know, can be accessed anywhere in the world, right?
Right.
And for example, the EU places restrictions, the GDPR places restrictions on transfers of personal data outside the European Union to countries that the EU considers as not providing adequate privacy protection.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
That's us. That's the U.S.
The U.S. is one of those countries.
Is Iran another country, by the way?
Well, yes, it is. But there's a whole process for determining which countries are adequate, and there's actually a list of adequate countries. In very few countries, I think there's lists of 12 or give or take countries that are now deemed adequate. But the U.S. is not one of those countries, and so moving data around in public blockchains where it's accessible anywhere in the world does constitute a transfer for EU purposes.
God, that's a headache.
Right.
Because then if you've got SWIFT, right, if they go on a blockchain,
right,
they have a problem.
Right. And there are ways in which U.S. companies can...
By the way, SWIFT is the international banking transaction conglomerate,
yes,
right? That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. But so the U.S. companies have ways in which they can do those transfers in a compliant manner. One of these is the Privacy Shield, the EU-US Privacy Shield.
I think I've heard of this, but tell me what that is.
It's a mechanism.
Tell us what that is.
Mechanism administered by the Department of Commerce. Over 3,000 companies at this count, I think, are certified. It's a self-certification process where a company essentially promises to uphold certain privacy principles with respect to e-origin personal data, puts in certain language into the privacy policy of the company, and then files a certification with the DOC.
It's essentially a treaty, right? Is that a treaty?
It's a treaty between the U.S. and the European Commission.
I've run into this, yeah.
Yeah, and it was preceded by this system called Safe Harbor, which went out the door because the Europeans were not happy with the protections that Safe Harbor provided. And
when did that happen? The Safe Harbor going out the door?
A couple of years ago.
All right. I think I was aware of this stuff when that happened too.
Right. It was a big brouhaha then. And so now we have the Privacy Shield. And so that's one of the ways in which U.S. companies, in the blockchain and other industries, can move data legally from Europe to the U.S.
Okay.
But still, again, how blockchains work, kind of going back to that whole challenge that this GDPR mold needs to fit a business model that's fundamentally different from the thinking that GDPR kind of grew out of, where you have one data controller that's calling all the shots. Then that gets tricky.
So it sounds like there's going to be some work for you in the GDPR blockchain world,
right?
Jarno.
Hopefully, yeah.
It's interesting. So there's it sounds to me like there's the problems that might have seemed obvious perhaps are not the kinds of problems that we really need to be worrying about just yet, but that there's plenty of opportunity for mischief to be made.
Right. There is. And we haven't seen enforcement activity toward companies that are utilizing blockchain yet.
Okay.
In terms of GDPR.
Right.
And I think one of the challenges there is that the regulators are still developing their understanding of how the technology works and different applications, as is the industry, by the way, right?
If it was the U.S., they'd be enforcing like crazy now.
So
they'd just be finding everyone.
So everyone is just kind of thinking their way through where can we use this, and the regulators are looking at how can we enforce the law, and then there's all these different applications to which blockchain, for example, can be used.
Right.
And different data that could go in there, all that. And so it's going to take some time before we see any action there. But the enforcement activity has, and we only have been dealing with GDPR for less than a year now.
Right.
And so if we look at the types of companies that have been impacted by the enforcement activity, there's been some ad tech, some large U.S. corporations that collect a lot of data,
right?
And so we haven't but no enforcement activity on the blockchain yet.
Or well, only on these large companies, right?
Right.
Okay, so
but smaller companies too. Yeah, we've seen enforcement activity. For example, in the ad tech space.
The Europeans hate advertisements on the internet, at least.
Right.
They're big fans of them on like bus stations.
Yeah. And so, for example, the French regulator went after what, on their face, looked like very small companies that operate in the ad tech space, but were collecting a lot of data from mobile devices.
Okay.
And so, I think it's going to be some time before we see any blockchain-related enforcement action.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. All right, so for the last set of questions, the last set of topics, and I should have run this by you, but we're it's a friendly podcast,
right?
And so, you've done business throughout the world, and you've been the head of one law firm's New York office. I know that you're constantly flying to Europe, and you're talking with some major companies, and you have a lot of clients that are like that. So I'd like to hear your biggest business lesson, the best business advice you would give to somebody.
Business advice?
Yeah.
I'm not in the business of giving business advice.
Oh, you certainly are. Law is a business, right? Your biggest business lesson. How about that?
Right. I think, anything. I'm humbly approaching that question. I'm not a sage of any sort, but I think that it's very important in a client-facing business to meet with clients in person. You can't, and for that matter, in any role where you service clients, it isn't only law, but all kinds of consulting work, for example. You meet with clients, it is critical in building their relationship, and that's one of the reasons why, because I do work with European companies quite a bit, so I do travel there. It's critical to building that relationship.
Do you find that you need to do that? How early do you try to start? Do you try to have your initial meetings with people in person, or do you do phone calls?
Initial meetings in person, if possible. Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard to get people's attention. I find whenever there's an event,
right.
I always feel like half the people are going to show just because they're busy and they want to see their families or go out with their friends.
Right. It's but it's just you build a stronger relationship that way.
How do you manage to do that? How do you get someone's attention? I'm not talking if you already know that they know a friend, then you can kind of get their attention. But how do you manage to get people's attention so that they're like, okay, you know what, I want to meet with this guy?
Well, I mean, before you get there, you have to do your groundwork, and you have to build your credentials as an expert in a specific subject matter. And once you've done that, then obviously that helps in setting up those initial meetings, right?
All right. Good advice, Jarno. So let's get if you have a Twitter handle, let's get your Twitter handle, whatever kind of feeds you do, whether it's LinkedIn or something else, and let's roll it out.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jason.
Well, what are they? What's your Twitter? Are you on Twitter? You're on LinkedIn?
No. I am on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, yes.
Okay. Any other forms of social media?
I'm, given the nature of my work, I'm
Internet privacy?
I don't. And lawyers, sometimes Twitter seems a little bit of a risky form for us.
Okay. All right. Well, everyone, you heard the man, the myth, the legend, Jarno Vanto. Thank you for joining us, Jarno.
Thank you, Jason.
And let's do this again soon, okay?
Right. Thank you.
All right.